Welcome to Leipzig, my background, and to the Dryden Ensemble's panel discussion entitled Troubling Voices in Bach's Sublime St. John Passion. First, a couple of housekeeping details. If you have questions throughout the presentation, you can enter your questions by typing them in on the Q&A feature. Don't use the chat for this, just use the Q&A feature. At the end of the discussion, you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom of your screen, and this will allow you to speak if we call on you. Sort of like being in grade school again. But I'm delighted that we have three wonderful panelists for today's discussion. I can't think of a better panel to discuss today's topic. I'm going in alphabetical order. Helen Charry, who is the Margaret W. Harmon Professor of Theology Emerita at Princeton Theological Seminary, where we often perform. She retired to have time to write a theological peace proposal between Christianity and Judaism. We have Michael Marissen, who for many years was Professor of Music History at Swarthmore College. He's published many articles on Bach and religion, both for general audiences and specialists. His articles for general audiences have appeared in the New York Times, Huffington Post, and the Lutheran Forum, and for scholars in many books and journals, most recently in the book entitled Bach and God, which I think is a particularly great title. He's retired from teaching now and is currently involved in a project of translations, heavily annotated translations of all 225 Bach cantata librettos, and he's doing this together with Daniel Melamed. We have Scott Metcalfe, who brings the musician's point of view to our discussion. He directed our St. John Passion in 2003 and again in 2020. He is artistic director of Boston's vocal ensemble Blue Heron, a wonderful ensemble that performs Renaissance music mainly. And he's also a very fine Baroque violinist, but now he seems to be spending most of his time in music before 1600. And he also was recently a visiting faculty member for a year at New England Conservatory. So welcome all of you. And I'm going to let Michael start off by just taking charge of the discussion.
Great, thank you, Jane. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be together with this panel here, because they're all people that I've known for varying numbers of years. I've only gotten to know Ellen more recently, but I'd certainly heard of her before, was a tremendous admirer from afar. And I've known Scott for a really long time, was a tremendous admirer up close, but now we've lived far away from each other for a long time, so I've sort of been admiring him from afar in the meantime. But it's just really wonderful to have three people together like this who have such high levels of commitment and expertise in ways that are complementary to each other, to what we hope will be useful and stimulating discussion today. We don't have a carefully worked out program. We just have some sort of general things we'd like to discuss, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. So Scott, I thought we would start by asking you, as a conductor, what, maybe give us a general sense, what exactly is a Passion oratorio, and what are the general challenges of conducting a large-scale work like this that are different from other kinds of conducting challenges, and how specifically the emotionally and religiously and intellectually controversial aspects of this particular work, how have you come at that as a thoughtful performing musician?
You want to give me a time limit? That's a big question.
Yes.
I'll try to answer concisely. Of course, in some ways, it's just like any other big conducting job. there's a lot of notes. You need to organize people and figure out how to get things together and shape an interpretation in what's always a fairly limited amount of time, given our current concert life. For a concert, which is not really anything like the original performance setting, so the piece will take on all sorts of new kinds of meanings that it didn't have then. And of course, the audience that you are expecting is nothing really, probably resembles Bach's original congregation, not very much.
Right.
We expect a much more diverse lot of people to come to a concert than he would have seen in 1724 or any time. This work in particular is so emotionally charged and so emotionally difficult to do. It involves all of the performers in a drama that's violent and ugly, and Bach applies all of his skills to heightening those aspects of it. So if you're not wrapped up in this turbulent, horrendous narration, you're not really doing the job. And so I feel that our job as performers is to, it's not that we necessarily have to experience that, although of course that's one thing that happens to performers while you perform, is you do involve yourself in the music. Other things we're doing are just trying to stay together, paying attention to technical things,
right.
Thinking about presentation and being more of a vessel, right? And we want the interpretation to sort of come through us. But it's the St. John is a very draining experience, and I feel very strongly that if it's not, then you've really missed the mark. So that means that if you're going to do it, you have to grapple with all the questions that it raises.
Yeah, I have to say, I remember when I first heard the Dryden Ensemble do this under your direction, was that in 2003? I remember saying then that, I go to a lot of performances of the John Passion, and some of them exactly were not, it's a good performance when you're really upset after it's done, because some performances you feel like the choir is saying, we regret to inform you that we're going to have to crucify you, and if that's the way it sounds, then you're, as you said, you're not really doing your job. But it's a weird job to have to do, and maybe that is a good sort of segue to asking some general questions then of Ellen. Of course, what has in the last few decades become sort of the most emotionally controversial aspect of the St. John Passion in particular is the issues of anti-Judaism surrounding it. So I wonder if you could give us, and also this, I'm sure you could easily talk about this for 5 or 6 hours, but if you could give us a sense of, what is anti-Judaism really, and how is that different from anti-Semitism, if it is, and how are they related to each other, and to what extent does the sensitive reading of the New Testament seem to reveal those kinds of problems? And in your experience as someone who loves choral music, I know you go to a lot of choral concerts, what's your sort of experience in hearing something like the St. John Passion as an extended meditation and interpretation on the Gospel of John's issues? What can you tell us what your experience with all of that has been?
Well, thank you, Michael. I'll start by saying the last performance of the John Passion that I heard, which was 2 years ago, it was so well done that I had to walk out after the first half, according to Scott's criteria. I knew that the anti-Judaism in the second half would be worse or more or deeper than in the first half. And it was so disturbing in the first half that I knew I couldn't stay. So that's my most recent experience with the performance. And the issue, you asked me specifically about the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. Yes, and it's an important distinction. Anti-Judaism is antipathy, or specifically in this case, Christian antipathy and contempt for Judaism as a religion. It's not necessarily about individual people, but it's about Judaism as a religion.
Right.
Anti-Semitism is antipathy and contempt for individual people, that is Jews, even though Semitism isn't the right word because there are more Semites than Jews, but that's a phrase that got established like in the 19th century and it just kind of stuck, even though it's wrong. But anyway, anti-Semitism is political, it's military, it becomes legal, and it is throughout the history of, once the church was legalized in the 4th century, civil disabilities were put on Jews until the 19th century. Emancipation of the Jews started in the late 18th century, but weren't accomplished until the late 19th century for the most part. So there's this long history of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. But when we come to the Christian scriptures that I call the apostolic witness, even to talk about, we can't talk about anti-Semitism in the apostolic witness. And technically, we can't even talk about anti-Judaism in the apostolic witness, either in Paul or in the Gospels or in Hebrews or everywhere else that it comes up, because at that time, there was no division between Christianity and Judaism.
Right.
So until we have that division, everything is really intramural disputes among Jesusites and non-Jesusites. But it came to be anti-Judaism once that separation was made. And John is specifically contributing to this problem because he uses the phrase, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, the Jews, even though most of the Jesusites were also Jews. All the Jesusites at that point were Jews, except for Paul's mission to Gentiles, which probably the author of the Gospel of John did not know about, even though they agree on a lot. So it's very complex, but the anti-Judaism is the consequence of reading these texts week after week, month after month, century after century, as if these are eyewitness accounts of what happened, which is not the case. We have no eyewitness accounts of the events that are discussed there. And John, because he uses the phrase the Jews so much, and actually there's probably nobody in our audience today who hasn't met Jews or isn't a Jew, so that it's easily transferred to actual living people. And even when the phrase the Pharisees or the scribes and the Pharisees are used, which seems to be a little mask for the term the Jews, all Jews living today are the descendants of the scribes and the Pharisees.
Right.
So Jews hear this with very different ears than Gentiles or Christians who are not aware of all this history. Father Edward Flannery, when he wrote the best book for lay people on this topic, it's called The Anguish of the Jews. In the very first paragraph, he said, Jews have memorized the pages torn from Christian and secular history books. So Gentiles, what is essential to Jews is often invisible to Gentiles and to Christians.
Okay, one clarification I was going to throw in there for sort of general audiences nowadays of both Jews and Christians and people who are neither of those is that many people assume that what the word Jew means nowadays, by definition, is someone who doesn't believe in Jesus. That's what the word means. And what's the big? And on this, they say that on the one hand, and on the other hand, they say, but they're very quick to point out that Jesus himself was Jewish and his disciples were Jewish, and so how can the New Testament be anti-Jewish? It can't possibly. So I think it's worth being clear about the fact, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I think New Testament scholars and theologians, sometimes this is so obvious to them that they might not realize that it's not obvious to everyone else, that the New Testament doesn't really use the word Jews much. It's really the Gospel of John that is sort of, it's just a couple times in the other books, but it's like 70 times in the Gospel of John. And even so, a lot of even careful readers don't notice right away that the way that the word is used is the way that it's often used nowadays, which means to mean someone who doesn't believe in Jesus as God's Messiah. But that was an unusual meaning in the first century. But what I'm driving at is that I looked through this very carefully several times, and it seems that every time the word Jew is used except once or twice, it was a little bit ambiguous, what the term refers to is someone who does not yet believe in Jesus or no longer believes in Jesus. There's no such thing, there's no person ever called a Jew in the Gospel of John who actually believes in Jesus, even if they go to synagogue and if they go to the temple and are circumcised and eat kosher, all those things. The word Jew is only ever applied to someone in the Gospel of John if it's clear that they don't believe that Jesus is God's Messiah. And so I wonder if you could, I know we don't want to get completely focused on the New Testament for an entire Bach symposium here, but if you could tell us just a little bit more specifically about within the Gospel of John, what it is that separates the people who believe in Jesus from the people who don't. And because that's the part that's going to be very relevant for Luther and Bach and so on, the idea, if you can tell us a little bit about the way Jesus is narrated as depicting Jews as killers and liars in the earlier part of the gospel. And then later in the gospel, it says, there's a time coming soon when not only are they going to kick you out of the community, but they're going to kill you and think that God is doing you a service thereby. That kind of language, I find a lot of people don't realize that's in there. I've had many people say, is that really in the gospel? Yes, it definitely is in the gospel, and Bach was very aware of it, which I'll tell people about a little bit more when we get to the part that I'm talking about. Can you tell us a little bit more about what kind of built-in hostility is there in the narrative of the Gospel of John that tries to separate people who believe in Jesus from people who don't? And why is it so focused on the idea that the central sin that a human can commit, according to the Gospel of John, as opposed to the other New Testament books, is not believing that Jesus is God's Messiah? That's the great sin, right?
When I've written on the anti-Jewish dimensions in John, and when I started thinking about it, I read it as I read it in several ways. First of all, I think it's like a video. It's like a video of what was going on at the time. It's not historically accurate necessarily, but it still envisions the conflict, the consternation, the confusion, and the disagreements that were so deep. And that's not only in the Gospel of John. The Gospel of Matthew is the same, but in the reception history, all non-Jesusites ended up being just opponents of Jesus, which was not necessarily true. Many, many people who heard him or heard about him were simply confused and conflicted about what to do about him, because he, especially in the Gospel of John, this is my other impression of the Gospel of John. This is a little sacrilegious to say, but Jesus presents himself as a crazy person. He says really rude and mean things, nasty things to people, including his own mother. People ask him questions and he deflects them, or he answers the question with a riddle that intentionally refusing to allow people to understand. He says, where are you? They say to him, where are you going next? He said, don't worry about it. You can't come anyway. And this goes on and on throughout this gospel. So it's a two-way street. People are confused. Who are you really? Where did you come from? They ask him. And he doesn't answer. And then he's intentionally disturbing them. But when John or whoever wrote John is writing this 50 years later, after the events, the lines had already hardened so that Jews were becoming, the word Jews were becoming people who opposed Jesus. But you have characters in the gospel itself, like Nicodemus. He's clearly confused. He wants to know what he should think about this fellow. And but subsequently, as Michael says, Jews just became known as people who disobey God because they don't worship Jesus. And that is what stuck. Not only that, but the other thing that became a central feature of Christianity until 1965 was the idea that, quote unquote, the Jews killed Jesus. Though that's not true. The Romans killed Jesus and so on and so forth. But, and John's contribution to that is not much. It's just that when he's confronted with questioners in chapter 8 that Michael was alluding to, he thinks that they're trying to kill him, which is not the case. But that fed into the notion of the deicide charge that the Jews killed Jesus, which is not formulated until the late 2nd century. It's not really in the New Testament, but the church read it as if it was and held that as the central feature of contempt for Judaism and for Jews until 1965.
Yeah, and I mean, this is a good place to segue then into how Bach in his Lutheran way picks up on some of these themes. And I may play a music example or two to, I mean, I know people know the John Passion well, but I might even want to make one or two quick contrasts between the way even other composers set the same text as to the way that Bach does. So I want to make a couple of generalizations. So the idea is then that what the St. John Passion is like the tenor soloist chants forth a verbatim the Passion narrative from the Gospel of John, chapters 18 and 19, word for word in Martin Luther's translation from the 16th century. And every couple of verses or so, the music breaks off into very, very different sounding music. That's either, say, a stanza from a hymn that's sung by the choir, and that's a very carefully chosen stanza from a hymn that's designed to comment or meditate on the passage that you just heard from the Passion narrative. Or everyone's favorite stuff with Bach, which is the solo arias, where you have a wonderful singer and an instrumental ensemble punctuating the various statements by the meditating singer on it. So it means that about a third or so of the whole thing is you're hearing the Bible story, and the rest is extended emotional meditation on it. But the important thing to know is that the things that Ellen already was talking a little bit about, is that people in Leipzig in the 18th century already knew the rest of the Gospel of John. So they didn't think of the St. John Passion as an isolated thing that was self-contained. It was part of a general strategy over the entire year in which you heard a vocal work every week that was a comment on the gospel for that week. And then at Easter, you really got a lot of, Easter and Christmas especially, you got really extended fancy stuff for several days in a row. And it's an interesting topic in and of itself. It was at first controversial whether you should actually have an extended meditation on the Passion in this kind of operatic style on Good Friday, because for years they had simply had the chanting of the biblical story. So it was a radical innovation in the early 18th century to allow there to be this essentially an unstaged opera on the Passion narrative. And they're very worried that and very focused on the idea that you're supposed to come away from this not being entertained by singers and talking about what a great performance it was and so on, but the function of the music was to remind you what a horrible sinner you were, and how in various ways you were in need of redemption. So on the one side, then Bach's parishioners knew John 8 and John verse 16, so they would have understood, just taking it for granted, that the Passion narrative is a telling of the story that follows logically from what was said earlier in the gospel, when Jesus is narrated as saying to Jews, you are born killers and liars because Satan is your father, and you want to be killers and liars. That's what they do in the Passion narrative. They kill Jesus and they lie to Pilate supposedly lie to Pilate about what it is that Jesus is up to. And then also they're further known to be violent in that business from John 16, that they had said to Pilate, he said, why don't you just kill him yourself? He says, well, we're not allowed to kill people. So Pilate does it for him, so to speak. But Jesus warns them that, there's a time coming when they will actually kill you, followers of Jesus. So that's my entree then into a couple of quick examples that I want to play. I'm going to go to share a screen here, and let's cross our fingers. And I know that's very unreligious, but I hope this actually works. So what you should see on the right of your screen is the text for Bach's church cantata number 44, Sie werden euch in den Bahn tun. That's Bach's choral setting, literally of Luther's translation of John 16, verse 2. And I'll play that for you in just a second. And then right after that, what I want you to be able to hear is that when the choir sings on the word, whoever kills you, the sort of the sound of the choir and the chords that they're using and so on and so forth are extremely similar to what the choir sings in the St. John Passion when they sing, we are not permitted to put anyone to death. It's almost like the cantata is a musical echo of the John Passion. And indeed, cantata 44 was performed just a few weeks after the St. John Passion. And I will contrast for you in that the reason I'm setting it up this way is that the generalization that I generally make about the St. John Passion is that the commentary on the story is much less anti-Jewish than almost all other composers from the Baroque period and earlier, even in this emotionally controversial work, the St. John Passion. So that's the good news on the one side. The bad news on the other side, however, is that the depiction of the biblical story itself, where you have the choir singing sometimes the group of Jews that is asking Pilate to kill Jesus, that choir sings in a much more ferocious manner than you ever hear in anyone else, including a great dramatist like Handel. So I want to play right next to each other Telemann's setting of the chorus singing, we're not allowed to put anyone to death. Lasts for about 4 seconds. It's just a piece of information. And the music is presented as if it's just information. I mean, it's one thing to say the choir says, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him, crucify him. Everyone expects that to be violent. But there's no reason why we're not allowed to put anyone to death. That's just information. That could be communicated very quickly and simply, and that's indeed what Telemann does. But Bach has the chorus repeated 25 times. It gets more and more ferocious and build up, and it's even if you don't know German and don't know what the text is, it just sounds violent, because Bach is what I would say he's going well beyond the call of duty here in making the Jews seem really, really bad. And then I'll contrast that then finally. I'll play all these examples right in a row. That's why I'm setting it up this way first. The other kind of music that the choir sings is those hymn stanzas that comment on the story. And one of them is this beautiful hymn, Will ich dir geben, and it says, in the bottom of my heart, your name and cross alone shines forth every hour, for which I can be joyful. Appear to me in the image for consolation in my distress of how you, Lord Jesus Christ, so abundantly have bled yourself to death to save us. And it's absolutely gorgeous. And that word milde in modern German is often mistranslated as gently, but it's a theological term from the 17th century. Milde means copiously or abundantly. So Jesus is really bleeding on the cross to save people. But this music is very, very calm and peaceful. And so what do I tell students at Swarthmore College, for example, who don't know German and don't know the Bible? They came away very strongly with the impression from the John Passion that there's really two, even though there's only one choir in front of them, that choir is depicting two groups of people, peaceful, God-loving Christians, as you can hear in this hymn, and violent, Jesus-hating Jews in the other. And so some people have said, well, the solution to this problem is don't pay any attention to the words. They said, well, that might work in some cases in other works, but you can't do that in the St. John Passion, because in the St. John Passion, if you don't pay attention to the words, it's even worse. Because sometimes Christians are actually reprimanded in the St. John Passion, but it doesn't sound like they're being reprimanded because the music is so peaceful. The words are very powerful, but the music is beautiful. So my point here is that I'm happy that Bach is not as bad as other composers on the commentary side, but I'm very concerned about the fact that he's so unnecessarily nasty in the actual depiction of the story itself. So now we'll very quickly play those three examples in a row, and then we'll see where that brings us. So here then is the chorus from Cantata 44. Telemann. That's it. Now check out Bach.
Da sprachen die Jüden zu ihm.
That's the Jews, here's the Christians. And so what a lot of people have said to me is that, oh, that's so beautiful. That's what the St. John Passion is really about. You know, I always get nervous when anyone says that something is really about something, you know, because when someone says that, it usually means what it's really about for them. And it's hard for them to imagine what it might be like for somebody else. And so what I often like to say too is that the genuine love for Jesus that people have that find that so moving in many cases ends up sort of in a way blinding them to, they're blinded by that love into not being able to imagine what it might be able to see other parts of the piece. So let me, it's just as a final observation, say here, to bring it back into the Gospel of John, it's also many times been pointed out to me, in John 4, though, Jesus is talking to a woman, and Jesus himself says to him, that salvation comes from the Jews. That's a positive thing we say. And I said, yes, it's true. He is depicted as saying that, but he says salvation comes from the Jews. It doesn't come for the Jews unless they stop being Jews and become followers of Jesus is the idea. So it's ironically what makes the piece in some ways, even the beauty, the genuinely beautiful aspects of the piece are in fact, in the end, what end up making the thing just as disturbing, I would say, in some ways. I'm reminded also of, I don't know if it's directly analogous, but Kurt Vonnegut says at the beginning, like one of the first pages of one of his novels, he's looking at the Taj Mahal. He says, oh boy, such beauty don't come cheap. And so, I don't know, does anyone want to pick up on where the strands that I know we're throwing all sorts of stuff, but it looks like Ellen's keen to say something.
Yes, I do. it's easy when you hear this music to say, oh, Bach was engaged in all this kind of anti-Judaism. But I think in a sense, Bach was only reflecting what was widespread. And he was doing in sound what artists had done with paint and sculpture for centuries.
Sure.
Exactly what Bach is doing in sound. And the way Jews have always been depicted, starting with the medieval mystery plays that this oratorio grows out of. The costuming, the language, the depiction, the woodcuts, everything, right. The paintings, all depicted this way, even, and we still have the residuum of that in the Ober-Ammergau Passion Play.
Yeah, I'm glad you're bringing that all up, because one of the other things I like to say, I keep saying this because I've done many John Passion discussions before, and that is that many folks also say, well, yeah, there are those great paintings, and then there's the Ober-Ammergau. Ober-Ammergau is an important event for many people, but few people actually think it's a great work of art. Whereas something like some of these paintings of the crucifixion, you go into the Met here in New York or in Boston and so on and so forth, they're absolutely fantastic paintings from an art history perspective. And so the defense in quotation marks often comes, well, but this art is so great that its greatness kind of transcends the emotional problems that are associated with it. And my own view, I think it's, not everyone has to agree with it, but I think it's worth considering, is that in fact that the greater the art, actually, the more disturbing it actually. This is, in a way, runs full circle of what we were saying with Scott at the beginning. It's a really great performance that is in fact the most disturbing, or a really great work of art is that. Yes, I have CDs behind me here of other passion settings by other composers that are Bach's contemporaries that say way worse things in their commentary. They're just absolutely horrible, but no one ever listens to them except for music history professors. And they're performed once every 25 years in some church in Germany somewhere. But the Matthew Passion and the John Passion, just like the Gospel of John, they're everywhere. You just, if you wanted to get rid of them, I don't think you should get rid of them, but even if you wanted to get rid of them, there's just no way to do it, because one of the reasons they really are everywhere is because it is really powerful, great stuff that has a lot of good stuff in it as well. But the good stuff, some people are, as I've said before, some people don't see the bad stuff because they're so focused on the good stuff. And that's what we're trying to do here, is to say that, to be a mature conductor, or to be a mature professor, or to be a mature listener, you should be able to sort of acknowledge the good and the bad and the in between. Looks like you're thinking, what do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was thinking, well, when you were playing, especially the chorus, the "We mustn't kill anyone" chorus, it reminded me immediately of what it's like to perform the piece. And I think part of the experience, which is underlined by a one-on-a-part performance by the singers, which is what Bach did. He had right. eight singers, but so the evangelist is the tenor and sings right. all the tenor arias and all the choruses, and the person who sings the words of Jesus sings the bass part in all those choruses and all the chorales. And the pilot, he's a bass as well, but he participates. So the participants in the ritual, the enacting of this, right. Incarnate all the different parts. So at one moment you're howling for blood, or you're making these, enacting this incredibly violent statement of a kind of quasi legalistic, and that's not the Jews are saying, that's John's words put in the mouths of the Jews. We right. can do this. We're enacting that, and then the next moment we're singing the chorale. Not right. that, that's the way till we get to that one that you just played, but this back and forth, so it's even more shocking in a way that you say crucify, crucify, or crucify, and then you say, wait, this is us. We did this. This is me. So I mean, this is something that the experience of going through this is cathartic in the I think in the classical sense that you actually experience all this awfulness and the love as well, and I guess what dominates in your perception after you're done, that it's going to vary from person to person.
Yeah, that's another really good point too, is that people's experience of this thing varies very wildly from person to person, but also person to person within the groups that they self-identify with. But I would just say, I don't think my spouse will mind my saying this, who's grew up secular Jewish. She's, I don't need to hear some choir harping on the Jews. There's lots of other stuff to listen to. She's a great Bach lover. She loves the cantatas, and Jesus doesn't resonate with her and doesn't need to, but she doesn't think that he's bad. And so, but she just sort of doesn't get why anyone would, why she doesn't understand readily why any Jewish person would tap their foot along to this and say, isn't this great? And I think, not many do. But I have sat with colleagues who do exactly that, and I go, are you listening, man, to what we're hearing here? And so, yeah, there is a very wide range of experience. And the other thing I want to say about that is that a lot of folks say about great art is that you should just listen to it and experience it, and let it be whatever it's going to be for you. And that what you don't want is some conductor like Scott or some theologian like Ellen or some historian like me telling you information that might make you experience it any differently from the way that you would if you just went and listened to it. And I'm not going to apologize about that. I'm not telling anyone how they're supposed to hear things, but I would like to call attention to certain things that people might want to think about. And that's what we're doing here. And the hope is that no matter where you were before, you'll have a more profound experience all the way around of the entire thing. Maybe this is the good point at which I know that I saw in my peripheral vision here on my phone that Jane had received a few questions already from people who are in the audience. So why don't we go into that? You want to take that over, Jane? I don't know where you are. Leipzig, yes.
We have two comments and questions from David Yee, who comes to a lot of our concerts and is a big Bach lover. He said, one commentator I've read asserts that John's Jews should be translated Judeans. Could Professor Charry comment on this?
That has been suggested about in 1973. I think that was first suggested. And some people have done that. The word Judeans, who these people were, they weren't really Jews yet, even though John uses that word. He uses that word because the book of Esther uses that word. And my own thinking about it is that this is a holdover from the Babylonian exile. And Judeans were exiled, and when they were in exile in Babylonia, they still considered themselves to be Judeans. And then when Cyrus allowed them to return home, not all of them came home, but some of them did, but many remained in the diaspora, still thinking of themselves as Judeans. Now, the people the people John calls the Jews, or the people represented by the scribes and Pharisees, they don't have a name for themselves yet. And these proto-Christian writers give them names. I have taken myself, and I'm not alone in this among scholars, I'm beginning to think of these people as Judahites. That is, they are people living in Judea and Samaria, for that matter, who are attached to the religious practices of what we call Second Temple Judaism. And so these words are up for grabs, actually, because the word Jews, even though it's used in the book of Esther, it's the word Jew is a kind of translation of the word Judean. Yehud is Judea, or in English, Judah. So there's a fair amount of confusion, and Judean is another mask, or even Judahite is another mask for these people who end up always being Jesus' opponents.
In fact, as you don't mind, as the music
How
is
to deal with the problem? Should you hide it or should you expose it?
yeah, I mean, I'm the music historian, so maybe I don't have the right to weigh in on this issue, but since my spouse is a novelist, and she says it's one thing, you can't answer a question like that simply by doing historical research and seeing what, like a dictionary from 100 BCE or 100 in the Common Era, how they would define a particular word. That's useful, but it's not the end of the story. The question is, how is the word used in this narrative? And it's very interesting to me that when Jesus is depicted as preaching to Galileans, who in the first century, in a dictionary or other groups, they would have considered a Galilean, that's a different geographical area. And if Judeans are people who are from the geographical area of Judea, even if they're not living there, that's one thing. But Jesus is depicted as preaching to Galileans, and he calls them Jews if they don't believe in Jesus as God's Messiah. And if they do believe in Jesus as God's Messiah, he calls them brothers or whatever. There are other terms that are used. So the question is, you sort of tally how it's actually used in the story, and how the way that it's used in the story might or might not be related to what was actually going on in the first century. But we don't actually know all that much about that time, right? So, but no matter how you translate it, the harsh reality is that group is negative. And so I think I think Ellen is right. I would agree that the motivation to do that might be good in some ways. But in fact, what it's actually doing is just masking things by suggesting that, oh, it was just a geographical term, and it actually has no consequences for what's going on in Bach's day or nowadays. But the issue for people in Bach's day, certainly in Bach's day, was not where these people lived, or whether they were in the diaspora or not. It was whether they believed in Jesus as God's Messiah or not. And you can call those people whatever you want, but whatever it is, it's bad. And they're on the negative side of this polarity between the peaceful choir and the violent choir. So I throw that out.
Part of the problem is that those who descended from the people John portrays as the Jews still call themselves Jews. Maybe they should have a different name. And then that would separate them. But history has served its purpose, and now we call people Jews.
Fair enough. Okay, so Jane, you said there was a second question. Unless Scott wants to weigh in on this too.
I wasn't going to answer that. I was going to bring up one of the other choruses, which, if we focus on all the sort of the crucifixion choruses and the violent, the sort of the so-called turba choruses, but there's this chorus towards the end that's the Roman soldiers,
right,
throwing the lot, to what they're going to, and this is Bach at his most it's insinuating in a kind of horrible way, again for the participants, if you are a believer, because it's super fun, this chorus. It's a moment of sort of levity in the midst of all this disaster, and it's a gas to play,
right.
But then because you're being sort of snared into this role of yes, you could find it funny and fun to throw lots while someone is dying, nailed up on a cross behind you with other people on either side of him, not as well. And I'm not I don't want to, I'm not speaking to Bach's intention, but as a participant in it, this is one of the things that's striking to me, is that it does reveal to you how easily one can be seduced into violence and hatred, how we all have that in us, and it's so easy to fall into. It can be fun.
Right.
So, another question.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
This is for Scott and Michael. Who, in your opinion, composed the second most popular or famous St. John Passion?
The second most famous or popular?
Right.
I don't know. What do you think, Scott? I mean, I know lots of John Passions, but I don't know how many that are actually famous and popular.
I mean, I think that the fact that probably no one in the audience, what's your next favorite one?
Well, for me, my next favorite one is probably Schütz, but I think the Schütz John Passion is very, very austere kind of thing that I'm going to guess most people have not, even Baroque music lovers have probably not heard very often, if at all. I have 6 or 8 John Passions just by Telemann alone up on the, and they're pretty tedious, actually. I love Telemann. He's a wonderful composer. Instrumental music is wonderful, and even a lot of the vocal music is wonderful, but some of the Passion settings, they kind of drag on. So if you're a really good ensemble and you want to do a large scale work around Easter time, there's a very high likelihood it's going to end up being the St. John Passion of Bach or the St. Matthew Passion of Bach, simply because they really are better than a lot of the other ones. There is a pretty good Mark Passion by that's I'm not sure exactly who it's composed by, but it's attributed to Kaiser.
That's just suggested Kaiser in the.
Oh yeah, okay. That's that one Bach also performed several times in Weimar and Leipzig with some of his own interpolations. But as wonderful as it is, it's one doesn't grade these things exactly, but it's a wonderful B+, A- one compared to the A triple plus St. John Passion or Matthew Passion. The one thing I think is very unfortunate doesn't get done more often, and I might talk about this a little bit next week in the lecture that's focused just on all aspects of the John Passion, and that is that Bach radically restructured the St. John Passion in his second year in Leipzig, and had substituted 3 or 4 arias in the middle of the piece, and you had used a different opening chorus and a different closing chorus. And it's fascinating from a musical point of view. The music sounds very different in extremely striking ways. And the emphasis, it gives a totally different emphasis to the whole thing, because the opening chorus and the closing chorus especially, but even the additional arias that are thrown in there are extremely focused on the question of sin, of Christian sin, which comes up a couple of times in very powerful ways in the standard one that everyone does. But where there it only comes up 2 or 3 times, let's say it comes up 6 or 8 times in the other one. So the shift in emphasis, and it's so wonderful musically, that other version, but so people are so accustomed to the classic version of it that they're reluctant almost to perform it in public, because what they're worried about is then people go, oh, what happened to my Ilo? What happened to Heron to Herrscher? That's my favorite. Where'd that go? Well, because that's a different version of the piece. So for Ellen, it's not quite the same thing as the closing of the Gospel of Mark. There's 2 different endings that have been tacked on later, and some people like one, some people like the other. There's something a little bit like that going on. But that's a good question. I don't think there are a lot of extremely popular John Passion settings, not to my knowledge.
So,
any other comments or questions there, Jane?
A comment from Fred about the chorus. The permutation fugue creates a seamless robe.
Okay. Yeah, that's some real inside baseball. I know we can
Yeah.
we can count on Fred for that, our good friend Fred. Yes, indeed. No, I mean, oh my God, you could go on for hours and hours and hours about the brilliant formal structures that appear in places like the John Passion, and to what extent they connect in such a wonderful way that they're not just showing off compositional acuity and so on, but they're marvelous compositional choices where the structure of the piece itself is related to the thing that's being talked about. And that's something that Bach is extremely good at, and much better at than practically anybody. It's not just that his music is more higher quality, but the relationship between the content of the text and the formal content of the music is more sophisticated than probably anyone else certainly in the Baroque period. Yeah, so good point, Fred. Thank you.
So another question from Hoytson van der Waal. To me, this passion story tells how we, humanity, killed Jesus. That is why the story is so powerful, a deep and sad event that is so well depicted in this music by Bach. It then changes to joy with the story of the resurrection of Jesus a few days later. When in Christianity did we stop blaming Jews for the killing of Jesus and make it a human story? That was my comment.
Well, I feel sure that Alan's going to want to weigh on in this too. but all I would say is that this stopping blaming Jews thing is a fairly recent development on the one hand, and on the other hand, yes, it is a beautiful human story and so on and so forth. But as I was saying a few minutes ago, it's a beautiful story especially for believers in Jesus as God's Messiah, or for people who don't care one way or the other. For them, it doesn't cost much for it to be a beautiful and powerful thing. But at least for people who are worried about blaming Jews for things that were probably not, all indications are there's injustice involved in that. It's hard to be 100% happy about the positive aspects of this thing when it comes at the price of either saying or implying that another whole group is out, where the Christians are in, the other people are out. Yes, it's beautiful the way that it depicts that idea, but there's something very unsettling about telling a beautiful story that is beautiful, that is at someone else's cost. And that's the hard thing to sort of come to terms with. I don't know if you want to add anything or say something a little bit more clear than what I just said, Ellen. Oh, you're muted still. Sorry, Ellen.
I think Bach himself is trying to do that, because between the words, the direct words of the gospel, which he throws a few lines from Matthew in there too, but in between, in the meditations, he is trying to identify the singers, or the observers, with the fact that they were the ones who crucified Jesus, because the focus, especially in Lutheranism, is on the heavy, or Protestantism generally, the heavy burden of guilt and sin, even for being human at all.
Right.
All human beings are sinful and deserve the wrath and hatred of God, and from the Middle Ages, and deserve to be killed by God. That being human is a mortal sin, a crime.
Right.
And so if you want to set this into a much broader context, which is refreshing in a way, and helps people over the specific violence that could be generated against Jews. Technically, as I said earlier, it was in 1965 that the Roman Catholic Church weakened the deicide charge that had been formal Catholic doctrine for centuries. And that happened because a French Jewish historian wrote a book, and there were a few books written in the 40s. And in 1963, Huel Isaac managed to have an audience with the Pope. And it was from that Cardinal Bia was charged with developing a statement against the deicide charge, which was adopted in Nostra Aetate, paragraph 4 in 1965. But it did not exonerate all the Jews. What it did was it said only the Jews who actually participated in the crucifixion should be held accountable. So that it's possible to say, yes, the Jews still did kill Jesus, but not all of them forever in perpetuity. That's the part that was dropped.
Right. Well, the thing the Lutherans would never drop, the Lutherans definitely in Bach's day believed that there was a solidarity of sin between Jews and Christians. But the difference was that the grace of God would save the Christians, and the grace of God would only save the Jews if they became Christians.
I want to say one more item about that.
Sure.
Theologically, in Christian history, either at the incarnation or at his birth or at his crucifixion or at his resurrection, whichever composite of those events one decides, it was at that moment that Judaism died theologically. And so any Jew who is a practicing Jew, a believing Jew, is for Christianity the walking dead. And that has been extremely difficult.
Ooh, indeed.
And it's called supersessionism, and it's only since the 1979-ish, 1975, 79, as a result of the uncovering of the Nazi genocide, that this is coming to the attention of a few Christians, and work has been done and is being done on many fronts. But it's almost all galvanized by Jews.
Yeah, in fact, that's an important point that many of my Lutheran colleagues are not aware that Luther wrote an excruciating book in 1543 called On the Jews and Their Lies, which Bach happened to own 2 copies. But the Lutheran Church did, through lobbying of various sorts in the 1990s, formally disavow those late writings of Luther on the very reasonable grounds that they don't contribute anything of value to Lutheranism, and that all the good aspects of Lutheranism, of which there are many, can be drawn without those late works. So, in fact, some Lutherans have even said to me, it's a pity that Luther didn't die a few years earlier, because most of the good stuff would have been there, wouldn't have been stuck with this horrible, these horrible late writings.
Even Luther's friends knew that that treatise should not be published, and they advised him against publishing it, and he did anyway. Even though this aura of anti-Judaism was deep within the church, not just the Lutheran church, he did it anyway.
Yeah, and the only reason I bring this up is not to bring up now obscure aspects of Protestantism and so on, but that these things were still very much alive. Some of my German colleagues say, "Oh, that these writings were completely unknown in Bach's day," and so on. It's completely false. I mean, Bach himself owned several copies, and other books that were in Bach's personal library quote extensively from them. So all this very harsh stuff is very, very alive. And I guess I would say, sort of as a generalization, I don't know how much time we have left here yet. In a way, it's actually surprising to me that the Bach repertory isn't a lot harsher than it actually is, because the context for it was very receptive, or very rich place for that sort of thing. But again, I'm sort of repeating myself. The reason why we're having these panels about Bach is because Bach is a really great composer that people listen to all the time, and we're trying to listen more sensitively and with new ears. The one other thing I would say in connection with that is that some folks also say, well, don't get involved in don't cancel Bach. I mean, you can cancel other stuff, but I don't want to, you can't cancel. No one here is saying that Bach should be canceled or that we shouldn't perform the John Passion. I myself take quite the opposite view, that for me, it would be ideal if the St. John Passion and the Matthew Passion and Handel's Messiah were performed even more often than they are, because it would increase the statistical likelihood that we would have sensitive and interesting discussions of the sort that are, because what we're doing right now was completely unheard of before the mid 90s or so, and it wasn't even much then, and it's picked up dramatically since then. And I think that I think we would all agree that that's an extremely good thing, and can only get even better yet. So Jane, did you have any other comments or questions from folks?
Does anyone want to raise a hand and ask a question? What year was your piece in the New York Times, the first one about the John Passion?
I think that was in the so-called Bach year 2000. Because the idea was the music critic for the Times asked me to say, can you do a 2,000 word version of your, because I published a book on the subject in 1998. And but that's the book got a fair bit more attention than most scholarly books usually get, which is not much. But certainly the once you write an essay in the front pages of the Arts and Leisure section of the Times, that gets a lot more that gets a lot more attention. I think that was, I don't want to take disproportionate credit for it, but I think that did contribute somewhat significantly to the rise of knowledge of the issues surrounding this particular piece, and the sense that some folks had, that even if they didn't really want to, that they really ought to probably have at least a program note or have some kind of acknowledgement that something is going on here, and not just blithely go on with business as usual. So yeah, that seems like a long time ago now, 25 years ago that the book, but that came out of, that's a whole nother thing in and of itself. That came out of experiences at Swarthmore College in the mid-90s. So we had a huge controversy surrounding a performance of it at the college there. And I was teaching a seminar that year on Luther and Bach. And I was so disappointed in the quality of the discussion. It was very clear that people wanted to talk about this and that people had lots of strong ideas about it, but I wanted to provide, at the very least, a proper translation of the libretto that says what it actually says, and talk a little bit about the music so that people could have that as a basis for further discussion. I don't know that I have it. I am publishing a brief essay on the subject now in Lutheran form very, very soon, but I doubt very much that I'll ever write another essay on Bach and religious polemic. And I know Scott has mentioned that he's not super keen to do like a gazillion performances of the Passions in the future anymore either. But I'd like to think that the four of us here have certainly done our bit in the past and now, and that I'm very heartened to see that other people are taking it up, though. In the meantime, it is, amongst depressing subjects like this, it is nice to see progress, some progress. At least not nearly as much as there should be, but the fact that there is any is heartening.
So I think we'll close now. I want to put in a plug for Michael's lecture next Sunday at 3 p.m. also, which focuses more on the music of the St. John, and he will discuss the 1724 version versus the 1725 version. It's really interesting. He gave I'm sure it'll be different, but he gave this lecture last year, a week before everything shut down.
Yeah, it was so weird. Yeah.
It was a fascinating lecture, so I'm sure you'll want to join us. And then 2 weeks from today at 3 p.m., join us to listen to our performance from March 13th of last year.
I have to tease you that I think it's so wonderful that all three of these events are right at the mid-afternoon, the very time that the events take place in the narrative that we're talking about. So that's brilliant.
I decided to keep all the events at the same time so people wouldn't get confused. So
very good.
Thank you all so much. I always learn a lot when I hear any of the three of you speak. So I'm really grateful. And Ellen, you brought a really wonderful point of view to this whole discussion.
Thank you.
Michael, thank you. And Scott, thank you. And I look forward to sharing the St. John in 2 weeks. And someone says, thank you, Ellen, for your knowledge of this topic. So there were a few people who attended the Friday the 13th performance in last year, and it was very moving. a lot of people were in tears at the end. So, or maybe you'll be angry.
Or both.
Both. So, and Helen, you know, since it's virtual, we won't know if you leave or not.
Right?
I really have to say, you really have to listen to Esses for Bach, because it's just incredible. So,
Very good.
all right, thank you all. And
Thank you, Jane.
And thank you, Asaf.
My pleasure.
I didn't mention our wonderful, our technical host today, who was very helpful when we had some technical problems at the beginning. So, other people say thank you. So,
Thank you.
Great.
right, we're signing off.
Bye.
Bye.